Recent headlines have suggested that food prices are rising faster than inflation or incomes, prompting concerns that consumers struggling through a pandemic-racked economy may be spending more of their dollars to feed their families. But what does the data really say? And are we talking about retail grocery prices, food consumed away from home, or simply about rapidly rising commodity prices? Welcome to Feedstuffs in Focus, our podcast taking a deeper look at big issues in the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries. I'm your host, Andy Vance. Thanks for joining us. In this episode, we talk with an agricultural economist who peels apart the layers of the food price inflation discussion and the implications for farm and food policy. We also discuss the concept of a commodity market supercycle, if we're actually entering one, and the prospects for general inflationary pressure over the next 3 to 5 years. Scott Irwin is the Laurence J. Norton Chair of Agricultural Marketing at the University of Illinois. His research on ag markets is widely cited by other academic researchers, and he is in high demand among market participants, policymakers, and the media. He's best known for his work on the impact of speculation in the commodity markets. Professor Irwin, I thought it was really interesting. I always enjoy following your Twitter feed. You share quite a lot of information of relevance to those of us who are interested in the agricultural commodity markets in general and a lot of specific areas in your areas of research interest. But you shared a couple weeks ago a headline from one of the wire services that talked a lot about food prices. And the headline was something along the lines that food prices are, quote, soaring faster than inflation and incomes. And you made the point in your series of tweets that headlines like that are a bit misleading. So let's start with the big picture. One, are food prices, quote unquote, soaring faster than inflation and incomes? And if they are or aren't, is that something we should be concerned about?
Of course, this is a complicated question right now because of everything in the last year that's gone on with the COVID pandemic. So let me just kind of step back and review what I would call the basics, the baseline when you're reviewing this. First off, we have to define carefully what we mean by the price of food. Is that the price of food at the farm level or the farm gate, it's sometimes called, or is it the price of food at the grocery store? Or is it the price of food, including everything purchased away from home at restaurants and through food providers? So you can see it can get to be a very complicated question. Now, that Bloomberg article, what I was basically arguing why it was misleading is because it was focusing on the idea of food price inflation being defined at the farm level. Like the FAO has very well-known quote unquote food price indices, but they're just basically farm level prices. And there's a world of difference between farm level prices and the retail, grocery store, restaurant prices. And so I think that's the disconnect that I was trying to deal with in that series of tweets.
And I think we've tried over the years in agriculture to communicate, at least to some extent, that story to the consuming public or journalists or other folks who pay attention to these sort of things, that and whether you could look at some of the different farm organizations' attempts to talk about the farmer share of the food dollar or whatnot. You point out that probably 80% of retail food costs are nothing whatsoever related to those farm level commodity prices or receipts from farms. Have we just done a fairly poor job communicating that message, or is that one of those things that just isn't super relevant to the food consumer, so it goes in one ear and out the other?
Well, it is relevant in terms of when people get concerned about food price inflation, which can be real. For example, in the last year, we have seen at that retail level, food prices are going up faster than the rate of overall inflation. That is true, mainly through pressure in livestock meat prices. So that's kind of a hangover from the COVID. But again, even there, we're talking maybe the last data I saw that food prices on average for the places that consumers are purchasing food have gone up about 3.5% in the last year, and overall inflation is about 2.5%. So that, People notice that in their grocery store bills and what they pay at, buying a steak someplace, if they're takeout or if they're going to a sit down restaurant now. So, it's noticeable, but that's far cry from a headline that food prices are surging, because what we've really seen is grain prices have surged since last summer. Yes, prices of some other things have gone up, but it's really a story about corn, soybeans, and wheat prices surging. And, that's at the farm level, and that will take a long time to feed into the retail level.
Which gives me a pause thinking about our audience at Feedstuffs, and so what you just said probably is going to make some feeders of cows, pigs, and chickens, wince a little bit. Feed costs, no doubt, going up, but I'm wondering, we've seen, I think, relatively resilient demand from the consumer for meat, milk, and eggs. Certainly, exports have done well in a number of those animal protein sectors, and domestic demand seems to be a-okay. I don't think we've seen a huge drop in appetite for beef, pork, or chicken, or eggs, or milk, and so on. So, how much of those increased feed costs do you anticipate we'll be able to, so to speak, pass on to the consumer, knowing that that's not really how it works? But how much of that demand, if you will, for animal proteins will pick up the slack and maybe allow feeders to keep the head above water?
Well, I think, that's obviously a prediction question. And, you can,
I mean, economists all have these crystal balls that are
yeah,
crystal clear and accurate, right?
yeah, mine is so perfect. Not, but I think that what I would really want to say is I think that the environment is probably going to be reasonably positive for that to happen, because I think the combination of the economy, this is the order. The pandemic is clearly receding. Exactly when it will end and what the end will mean is uncertain. But it certainly appears that the very worst is behind us. The economy is also beginning to pick up. And then we're getting massive government stimulus on top of that. So I think in that environment, I think it will be probably easier for those kind of price increases to be passed on. It's interesting to me that the capital markets are forecasting that. We've had quite a little change, not a little, quite a change in inflation expectations in general for the economy that have been reflected in forward interest rates in our capital markets this winter. So everybody's expecting in the markets more inflation, which at least in the short run, as long as it doesn't get out of control, probably will help the livestock industry pass on some of those costs a little bit easier.
And not that anyone would confuse Paul Krugman for being an ag economist per se, but he had an interesting piece over the weekend talking about some of these inflationary concerns, and it was all in the context of paying for the next infrastructure push, whatever form that ends up taking. That seems to be something that once this stimulus package, this Recovery Act package is kind of put to bed and out the door, that maybe the next big effort would be on infrastructure. Certainly something that bears watching, I would say, in the commodity space, as that's been a competitive advantage for us. But what I'm wondering, Krugman talked about this idea that the secular stagnation, and not to get super wonky for the listeners who aren't, into all this sort of macro mumbo jumbo, but when you look at the idea of inflation, one, how comfortable or confident or concerned are you about seeing an inflationary environment take hold? Did we pump too much potentially into the economy with this $1.9 trillion package, and or is Krugman onto something that it's probably not going to be as bad as we fear it's going to be, because we've been in a pretty low inflation environment for quite some time now?
Well, I would say that Krugman's reflecting basically probably conventional wisdom among economists. And I think that he's probably right in the short run. I mean, there's just a lot of inertia in the economic system, and we've got a lot of slack capacity in a lot of industries. So I think he's right in the short run. But what makes me the most nervous in the intermediate to longer run, looking out 3, 5, 10 years, this is what the Krugman's words are exactly what is said right before major inflationary episodes get rolling. Mark those words down. Every time in history, we think this time will be different. And the macroeconomic fundamentals of what we are doing right now is got to keep your eye on the fundamentals, is this massive stimulation of the economy. And at what point will there be too many dollars chasing too few goods, which is how you get general price inflation. Again, I think it's probably unlikely to show up here in the immediate future. I'm more concerned that we are sowing the seeds of a cycle that will be hard to end as we go 3, 5, 10 years down the road. Who's going to take away the punch bowl? Eventually, we will have to.
Money's been cheap for a long time, and I would say certainly that's been to the benefit of a number of operators. Certainly, if I think about land prices have continued to go up, but money to finance land deals has been relatively inexpensive. Interest rates are still at relatively historical lows. When would you think interest rate risk would be more of a concern, in that 3 to 5 year range you're talking about, or longer out? I mean, I'm just wondering about the mechanisms that the Fed has at its disposal to combat some of those inflationary concerns, or maybe they're not. Maybe they're on the same page with you that, hey, we gotta turn off the faucet at some point.
Well, they know that, but that will become intensely political decision, and it will intersect with, in particular, presidential election cycles. And right now, the market has shifted from kind of a sense that we're in 1 or 2% inflation outlook for as far as the eye can see. This winter, the market is now expecting more inflation. That's embedded into long-term Treasury bond rates, inflation bonds, tips. They're all showing that's ticking up. And again, the problem that I'm concerned about is history says, once you've turned this giant super tanker of an economy from stable prices to increasing prices, it tends to have a self-fulfilling mechanism, because that inflation rate gets embedded into automated wage increases. And, it takes, if it gets out of control, it takes a severe economic shock, like we last really went through to begin getting inflation under control, starting in 79 through about 82, an incredibly severe recession. So we're not there yet. I hope people hear me clearly on that, but that is my concern looking in the long run. And it might well be precipitated at some point by a funding crisis for the US government. The twin issue here is we're now in uncharted territory as far as the US national debt. Our US national debt is now more than 100% of GDP. And that is, at least historically, certainly a lot of yellow warning lights begin to flash about a country's macroeconomic financial health when you pass that Rubicon. Maybe because of our unique situation in the world economy, we have more grace on that than history suggests, but we've used up all of our margin for borrowing.
I want to dig in a little deeper. Where we started this conversation was talking about food prices, and of course then the disconnect between those and the maybe, let's say, 20% of food prices that come from raw commodities. So let's really tap into your expertise in ag marketing and the corn and soybean markets, perhaps in particular. I'm hearing this term, and we've had a couple of guests on the program in recent weeks talking about the idea of entering a commodity super cycle. Is that something that you're watching and thinking about as well, or is this just one of those buzzwords that journalists use because they need to file some copy on what's happening in the grain markets?
Well, first off, super cycles should only occur once every 20 or 30 years. So it's clearly we did have one, whatever that really is, whatever a super cycle really is, that did happen in the mid 2000s. And now, 10, 15 years later, it's going to happen again. So that makes me kind of skeptical, number one. Number two, I don't really see the combination of factors that are going to put us into a new long-term super cycle with permanently higher prices. In the grain markets, I think a better template for what we're going to experience is 1995-96 than, say, 2007, 2008.
I find it really interesting because I was thinking about when my younger brother started farming at the home farm where we grew up, and it was in that, late 90s, early 2000s. And it felt like for, my dad's generation, $2 corn was just a thing. And then, all of a sudden $4, $5 corn and such was more the norm than the outlier. And I told him all those years, pay your taxes and put some cash in the bank, because this ain't going to last forever. And we've kind of gone through the ups and downs and so on through that. What's your expectations here? Let's go over the next 12 years, but maybe in that 3 to 5 year range. If you're a cattle feeder, if you're a hog feeder, you're a dairyman listening and thinking about feed costs over that next 3 to 5 years, should corn prices look like they look now, or are you expecting movement one direction or the other based on those kind of fundamental factors you've talked about?
I definitely view these as very high prices from a longer run perspective. So always predicting out that far is tough, but if you're looking at like a range on corn prices, depending on where you're located, of course, makes a difference, but cash price of corn, probably in the longer run of maybe $3.75 a bushel is what I think is more likely. If you're really a little bit more optimistic, you might say $4. So that's a lot lower than where we are today in the mid to lower fives.
Thoughts on soybeans?
No, so I take, I would say soybeans, probably, just giving kind of a rough guy. I would say the longer run price would probably be about $9.50.
Professor, I want to thank you. This has been, I think, a really good, wide-ranging set of topics, and I appreciate you following down some rabbit trails with me and digging into it. But I just find the number of different topics that all relate here into this big picture, and as it affects food policy, farm policy, there are a lot of implications at play for what a new administration and Congress may do in those various areas. And your insights are invaluable. So thanks for joining us on the program.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you. I enjoyed going down those rabbit holes with you.
For the latest reporting on the commodity markets, what's happening relative to livestock and animal feed production, and ultimately how it affects your business, visit our website, feedstuffs.com. And join us in our new virtual community and events platform, Feedstuffs 365. This week's programming featured, among other things, a visit from the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, as well as an in-depth discussion of the phosphate markets. You can always go back and view those sessions on demand as part of your Feedstuffs subscription. I'm Andy Vance, and you've been listening to Feedstuffs in Focus. Thanks for joining us today. If you want to hear more conversations about some of the big issues affecting the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries, subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platforms, including Apple and Google Podcasts, or you can check out our website, feedstuffs.com, for future episodes. Until next time, have a great day, and thanks for listening.